Right guys, this is our last lesson of attachment. Before we start, you'll need your attachment workbook, page 23 to 24, to follow this PowerPoint, so get that in front of you, pause it if you need to, and I have put a document on called the Love Quiz, which I will be referring to later. You can actually do the quiz if you want to later, but otherwise you can just have a version of it near you to have a look at. So get your stuff ready to start. Okay, before we get onto the content then, there's 10 phrases based on previous subtopics with attachment. I just want you to have a look at them and think, can you remember what they refer to? So if they would be the answer, what could the question for those phrases be? What did they relate to? Just pause it if you need to and try and think about what each of those 10 phrases were. Okay, so there's a couple that I wanted to bring our attention to just to get these ideas back into your head. So number one, internal working model. This was a mental representation of what someone thought relationships were like, and it was based on their first attachment. It was a template from that for their future relationships. Number 6, Bailey et al., 2007. Wasn't sure if you'd remember this, but this was one of the studies we used to support Bowlby's theory, Bowlby's monotropic theory of attachment. So remember, that's different from his maternal deprivation theory. So Bailey et al. Provided support for the internal working model. They found that mums who were classed as a certain type of attachment with their own babies also showed similar attachment types to their mothers, so it suggested that they'd picked up that template of attachment from their mum and also transferred that to the relationship they had with their baby. So that was Bailey et al. Support for the internal working model. And I will say number 7 as well, continuity. That was the idea that the effects of the first attachment affect development in later life. Okay, so internal working model is all about the types of relationships you have later based on your first attachment, whereas continuity is about the rest of the development in your later life. So if we think of the Romanian orphans as well, having that lack of attachment led to negative effects on intellectual development and physical development. That would be the effects of continuity. Okay, so early attachment affecting other areas of development in your life, and that was another of Bowlby's ideas from his monotropic theory of attachment. Okay, just wanted to get those 3 phrases into your head. Big question to start us off today to think about. Based on everything we've talked about with attachment so far, do early attachments influence later relationships? Think of everything we've talked about with attachment, the theories, all the different studies we've looked at. Come to an overall judgment. Do you think early attachments influence later relationships? Could even be based on your personal opinion. You might think the opposite from what the evidence says. Alright, let's make a start then. So, final topic of attachment, right down at the bottom, the influence of early attachment on childhood and adult relationships, and it's including the role of an internal working model. So we did have to mention this once before within Bowlby's monotropic theory, but we're coming back to the idea of internal working model again now with this final topic. And another thing to bring our attention to as well, early attachments, but we have to look at how it affects both childhood and adult relationships. Okay, so different types of relationships for the rest of that person's life. Alright, so we saw through Bowlby's monotropic theory that a child's first attachment forms a mental representation of that relationship, and that was the internal working model that provided a template for future emotional relationships. So emotional, kind of like intimate relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, guess that'd be it, really, wouldn't it? Yeah, romantic relationships, friendships, relationships with your own children as well. Yeah, family relationships. So I guess not relationships like formal or professional relationships, just emotional, intimate ones. So, for example, a child whose first experience is of a loving relationship with a reliable caregiver who is always there for them when they need them, that child will tend to assume this is how relationships are meant to be. So later in their life, they will seek out functional relationships. They think they deserve a healthy relationship. So this is what they kind of look for in a partner in a relationship. And they will also behave functionally themselves within them. So they won't be too uninvolved or too emotionally close, which might be characteristics of insecure avoidant, and they won't be controlling and argumentative, characteristics of insecure resistant. Obviously, this is a bit of a generalisation, even people who do have healthy relationships, there's always examples of arguments sometimes, but it's just overall like the thing that characterises your relationship. Overall, if you've had a good one as a baby, you will tend to have healthy ones when you grow up. A child with bad experiences of the first attachment will bring the bad experiences to bear on later relationships. This might mean that they struggle to form them in the first place or behave inappropriately when they have them, displaying avoidant or resistant behaviour towards partners and friends. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, the different attachment types and how they might be seen in relationships. Okay, we've got one big key study for this topic, Hazan and Shaver, 1987. So their method was a questionnaire. It was placed in a local newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News, so it was in Canada. The questionnaire asked about current relationships and childhood attachment types. So all of the participants were adults at the time of filling it in, but they were asked, what was your relationship with your mum like when you were young? So they were asked about past experiences. And the quiz asked about attitudes to love and romantic partners. It was actually an assessment of the internal working model. So when you think of that idea, internal working model, that template, that's something kind of unconscious. It's something that we couldn't really see in anyone. We wouldn't be able to directly observe it and say, oh yeah, this is what this person's internal working model is from looking at them. It is an unconscious idea, but that's what this love quiz was trying to test from Hazan and Shaver. So there were 620 responses, those amounts from men and women. And we've got to think, because it was placed in a local newspaper and people responded to fill in the questionnaire, it was known as a volunteer or self-selecting sample. So we might already be thinking, why could this be a problem if these people have chosen to take part in this study, asking about their relationship experiences? So specifically, Hazan and Shaver classified the adult attachment types as children and the quality of their current relationships. Okay, we'll have a quick look at the love quiz. You can complete it yourself if you want to, but if not, I'll just talk you through it quickly. So this is only a shorter version of the actual one that Hazan and Shaver would have given to their participants, but nevertheless it is a real extract of it, so it does give us a bit of an idea of the real questionnaire. So just have a look at some of these questions. Parents' relationships with each other. What was your relationship like with your mother and father? Next questions asking about the respondents' experiences of intimacy. How do they feel about getting close to people? Do they worry about being abandoned? And then last few questions, attitudes towards love. Okay, so how does this person feel about love and relationships? Alright, if you do want to do it yourself, just pause it now before I go on to the results and how to score it. So the different kind of clusters of questions, 3 questions each, they are assessing different things. So 1 to 3, attachment history. In other words, what was your attachment type like when you were a baby? 4 to 6, adult attachment type, current ways you act in relationships. And 7 to 9, mental models of relationships. In other words, what is the overall internal working model of this person? So when you've done it, whatever letter you answered for each of those questions, that would be the type of attachment that you were classed as if you entered that letter. And then for each of those 3 subsections, like we just said, whichever of those attachment types you score most frequently, you chose the most, that is your dominant category. So if you scored like 2 secure in that one, you said secure for 2 of them, you would class as secure for that category. That one was attachment history. Okay, and it's the same for the others. So you might actually end up with 3 different scores. All right. So we'll go back to recapping the attachment types. Remember the main attachment types we said from Ainsworth's strange situation? Those 3. I'll just put descriptions on for you. So remember when Ainsworth was looking at these behaviours in the strange situation, if the babies were acting in a certain way, she would classify them as each of these attachment types. Remember secure base, that was whether the baby felt confident enough to go off and explore the unfamiliar room, but it would always kind of keep coming back to the mum, almost like checking she was there, checking in with her, like, I know you're always going to be there for me. I feel confident enough to go off, but I know you'll always be there for me when I need you, kind of thing. That was the secure base behaviour. Insecure avoidant, we might think of this as much more independent, just not really bothered either way. Maybe for some reason this baby has learned to be independent, look after itself, self-soothe. And insecure resistant. This is the one that we think of as much more clingy when the caregiver is there, but also very, very distressed when the caregiver leaves the room. But even when the caregiver comes back, they're unable to be comforted by them. The thing that's made them really distressed in the first place is the caregiver leaving them. So you'd think they'd be comforted when they return, but it's almost like, I don't trust you, you've left me once, so I'm not getting close to you again. You know, I'm not taking that risk, so go away from me, you're not comforting me. All right. What I want us to think then, guys, is, so they're the attachment types that babies, very young infants, would show, the behaviours. How do you think people with each of those attachment types would act in adult romantic relationships? So if someone was currently in a romantic relationship but they had one of these attachment types, how do you think they would act? All right. So secure as an adult, we might think of this as the most healthy type of relationship, like feel able to be close to your partner, but you both also have your own independence within the relationship. And that could be similar to like secure base behavior as well, like always know that the partner is there for you, but you feel confident, independent enough to go and do your own thing, and you trust them to do their own thing as well. You know, even if you are separated from them, you are sad, but then when you're reunited with them, this is a happy experience for you because you trust them. Insecure avoidant as an adult, we might think of this as the type of person who is emotionally closed off from relationships. Like maybe they might be the kind of person who doesn't even get involved in relationships in the first place. They don't think they have to rely on anyone because they can just completely rely on themselves. But even if they're in a relationship, they might be the kind of person who a partner accuses of being distant or not opening up to them and that kind of thing. And finally, resistant in an adult relationship. Again, we would think of these as clingy, so not able to give the partner space, very suspicious if the partner does leave them and go off and do their own thing, does something that's not directly related to the relationship. And for this reason, they might be jealous as well. So, like, you know, where have you been? Always checking the partner's phone, this kind of thing. And then if the partner would try to make it up with them, they might not even let them do this, like the equivalent of the baby pushing the mum away. The partner tries to make it up to them like, no, I'm not trusting you, you've let me down, or I think you've let me down once before, so I'm not letting you get close again. Okay? So what Hazan and Shaver did in their findings, they focused on a couple of different things. First of all, from all the 620 responses, they classified the adult attachment types into those three categories that we'd see from the strange situation, and they were the percentages that were classified in each category. What you'll notice about this as well is it's kind of a similar balance or proportion of what Ainsworth did find about the proportions of baby attachment types. So secure being the most common, avoidant a bit less common, and then resistant the least common attachment type. So you could even say these findings of adult attachment types add to the validity of Ainsworth's findings of infant attachment types. Okay, so they were first looking at the proportions. What you've got to think as well is the love quiz, this questionnaire that Hazan and Shaver used, that is the equivalent of the strange situation, but it's a way of assessing adult attachment types. So you use the strange situation for babies, you'd use the love quiz to assess an adult's attachment type. Okay. They also looked at the different experiences of relationships for each of the attachment types. So secure adults reported having longer lasting relationships, average 10 years, and described the love experiences as happy, friendly and trusting. Resistant and avoidant adults reported shorter relationships on average. So resistant average length was 5 years and avoidant was 6 years. And they collectively reported more negative attitudes towards relationships, including feelings of jealousy, like we said, might be a characteristic of resistant type, and also fear of intimacy, might be avoidant, scared of getting too close to someone. So what you could say about this study is the findings suggest patterns of early attachment behaviour are reflected in adult relationships. Okay, so the type of attachment you have as a baby, this does seem to continue and kind of mirror the behaviours that you show as an adult in a romantic relationship if you have a particular attachment type. Okay. Okay, so Hazan and Shaver, this is the key study. This is a very important one that you need to know. And when people are always asking about the percentages or do I need to know them and stuff like this, obviously it is better to, but if you can't, just remember that the order that they go in, so secure most common, then avoidant, then resistant. But obviously it is good, better if you can remember the percentages. Okay? So we'll look at some other studies, effects on other relationships in later life. We'll start by looking at childhood friendship. So this is another type of relationship that psychologists have investigated whether early attachment type has an effect on. Okay, so many studies have found a link between early attachment and later emotional and social behaviour, like in childhood friendships. We've got one study from Kearns in 1994. This was purely looking at each of the attachment types and how this seemed to affect this person's friendships when they were a child. So children classed as secure tended to be less isolated and more popular, so they had more friends in general. This can be explained in terms of the internal working model, as they had high expectations of relationships and were more friendly and trusting. On the other hand, insecurely attached children tended to have more friendship difficulties. Okay, so those kids who had been secure as a baby, they'd built up that template of a healthy relationship. This is what I expect from people. This is the way I expect them to treat me. So as a result, they tended to be less isolated and they also had more friends, more healthy friendships. There's also another study from Myron, Wilson and Smith. This is looking at something slightly different. This is looking at the effects of bullying resulting from the different attachment types. So they looked at the attachment type and bullying using standard questionnaires in 196 children aged 7 to 11 from London. Secure children were very unlikely to be involved in bullying. Insecure avoidant children were most likely to be the victims of bullying, and resistant children were most likely to be bullies. Okay, so this is quite an interesting one as well. Think insecure avoidant, bit more distant, independent. maybe they feel less like they need to make strong friendships, maybe they're a bit of a loner, that kind of thing. Maybe this makes them a target for bullies if people see them as a bit unusual, keeping themselves to themselves. And then resistant, if they are kind of clingy, maybe they are desperate for attention, and even if that is negative attention for them, it is still attention nevertheless. So maybe they become bullies because then at least they're having some kind of interaction and attention, even if it is negative for them. That would be better than having no interaction or connection whatsoever. So maybe this is why they become bullies. Okay. We can also think, especially with this second study, Myron, Wilson and Smith, there are any problems with the methodology of this one. So have a look at how they were assessing attachment and bullying. You've always got the problem with questionnaires. People might answer in the way that they think the psychologist expects to make the participant themselves look better. Try and remember the name for that. Remember, it was social desirability bias. I remembered. I was just trying to get you to see if you could think of it. So we've got the risk that people might answer in a way that they think the psychologist expects. But then you've got to think, these kids were aged 7 to 11. Maybe they wouldn't have really figured that out by that age. Maybe their concern wouldn't have been to look good for the psychologist. So maybe children are more likely to answer honestly. Don't know. You could kind of use that in an essay if you were using this study. You could extend your discussion, your evaluation a little bit by saying that. So we've got the risk of social desirability bias, but maybe this is less of a problem in children. They're maybe more likely to be honest anyway. They're less concerned with how they look to a psychologist. All right. So that's it for childhood friendships, those two studies. We'll also have a look at other relationships in later life. So remember, another type of relationship that early attachment could affect is the relationship someone ends up having with their own children. Okay, so in terms of parenting, we already saw that Harlow's monkeys showed that the deprived monkeys became unresponsive and aggressive parents. Some of them even killed their own children when they eventually reproduced. Hopefully it's not too extreme in humans, but we've got kind of some equivalents. So Quinton, in 1984, compared a group of 50 women raised in institutions like orphanages with a group of 50 women raised in the normal family home, and found that the institutionalised women in their 20s, when they'd had children of their own, they were finding parenting extremely difficult, and this was likely due to their internal working model. So they'd built up a negative one as a result of being raised in an institution, and then they ended up kind of projecting or putting this onto their own children. They were finding parenting difficult. Go back to this one, Bailey et al. So remember, you did have this one in your notes for Bowlby's monotropic theory as well. They found that mothers who reported having insecure attachments to their own mothers when they were young were also more likely to have children classified as insecurely attached. So again, this supports the idea of the internal working model providing a template for future relationships. It kind of makes sense when we think about it. The experience of relationships you've had when you were young seems to then pass on to how you treat other people, because that's what you expect, that's what you see a normal relationship as. Okay? One last thing, so this isn't exactly an effect on relationships, but I suppose it's an effect on a person that could affect how they then approach relationships. So we've said before, well, we said it actually with the strange situation, but attachment in general, it is one of the kind of main accepted ideas in psychology now. Whatever psychology course people do around the world, attachment will always be one of the topics that they learn because it's just one of the most kind of valid, accepted and reliable ideas, concepts within psychology. It's pretty much accepted that to some extent the attachment type someone has when they're young does affect their later behaviour. We're not quite sure to what extent, but it is at least accepted. So Another way it does seem to affect people's behaviour is in terms of their mental health. So lack of an attachment during the critical period, that key time period when it's most important to form an attachment, this could result in the lack of an internal working model, so just a complete lack of a concept of relationships and what they're even like. Children with something called reactive attachment disorder have no preferred attachment figure, an inability to interact with others before the age of 5, and reactive attachment disorder is a recognised psychiatric condition and included in the DSM. If you think back to psychopathology, you might have mentioned the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It is basically a massive book checklist of all the different mental disorders that people can be diagnosed with and a list of the symptoms with them. So reactive attachment disorder is seen as its own mental disorder. The kind of behaviours we might associate with this are what we think of as psychopathic. So think of Bowlby's affectionless psychopaths as well. Lack of empathy, lack of feelings of guilt, inability to relate with others. These would also be characteristics of reactive attachment disorder. Okay, it's seen as a mental health condition. There is a good documentary you can watch about this if you're interested. I think it is still on YouTube. It's called The Child of Rage. It's about this little girl called Beth who had really bad attachment experiences when she was young, and it kind of follows her as a child, looks at what her development was like, and then also how she kind of went on as a teenager and that kind of thing. So that is an interesting one to look at if you are interested. So it's The Child of Rage. It should be on YouTube. It is a little bit disturbing. So she kind of does psychopathic things even towards her own brother. So it's just a little bit of a trigger warning before you watch it, but it is a good one. I'd recommend it. Okay. Right, moving on then, guys. So there is quite a lot of studies for this topic, but I'll tell you about how you can reduce it down later. Think about all of the studies investigating it. Can you think of any overall problems with the methodology? Is there anything wrong with how the psychologists were studying the influence of early attachment on later relationships? Alright. First of all then, it is correlational. All of the research only shows a link between early attachment and later relationships. You can't exactly say that one causes the other. You know, to be able to do this as psychologists, we'd have to get a group of babies, make half of them have a healthy first attachment and half of them have an unhealthy one, and then see how it affected them as an adult. That'd be the only way that we could establish cause and effect and say, yeah, having this relationship when you're a baby leads you to be in this way when you're an adult. We know we can't do this as psychologists, it's unethical, so psychologists have to rely on this correlational data showing a link, but obviously we've got the problems with that as well. You know, we can't definitively say that early attachment causes what you see in later relationships. It could even be other factors that affect it. Another massive problem with all of these studies, but particularly Hazan and Shaver, they rely on retrospective classification, so asking questions to adults of things that have happened earlier on in their lives, you know, quite a few years, maybe even like 20 years ago in some cases. You think of like retrospective, retro, going backwards, like retroactive interference even in memory, so retro going backwards. If you think, even if you guys know as like 16 to 18-year-olds, if someone came to you and said, you know, what was your relationship with your mum like when you were 2 or even 5, like it's unlikely that you'd remember it that accurately. But also, you've got the risk that people might not even be honest. Even if they do remember it, they might not be completely honest. They might almost have like a rose-tinted view of the early relationships. They might remember it as much more positive than it was in reality. But equally, if they're now finding life difficult and they're struggling, they might blame the parents. They might say, yeah, my parents didn't treat me that well. I didn't have a good early start to life. And it might not be that negative in reality, but they could maybe even make it seem worse than it was. So a couple of problems with collecting retrospective data. Few more problems. Think back to when you were learning approaches and you had this idea of determinism. That was one of the ways you could evaluate approaches. If something is deterministic, it sees someone's behaviour as caused by factors that are out of their control. Okay, so someone is a certain way because of the things that have happened to them in the past. They didn't have any control over it. They had no choice in the way that they're currently acting or what they're currently experiencing. Okay, obviously the opposite viewpoint is free will, that sees humans as having choice over how they're currently behaving. If we ever class like a theory or idea as deterministic, that's usually seen as a negative viewpoint, okay? Because most people want to believe that they have free will. If you ask any person, they would say, yeah, I'm in control of my life and my destiny. I choose what happens to me. So if you class any theory as deterministic, that is usually seen as a negative or pessimistic view. So research into the effects of early attachment on adult relationships suggests that there is a fixed relationship. So children who do start off as insecurely attached as infants, 1 year, they're doomed to experience emotionally unsatisfactory relationships as adults. But we know that this is not always the case. There are many examples of people who do experience healthy relationships despite not having been securely attached as infants. Even you might think some people seem to go the opposite, don't they? If someone's had a negative experience themselves, it makes them even more like eager and determined themselves to be like, I'm going to make sure my children don't have the same experience that I had. So, we kind of know at an instinctive level that this is not always the case. Your relationships that you have early on don't always doom you to have similar types in the future. So the idea of it being deterministic is a pessimistic view or negative view of human behaviour, seeing people as doomed to be a certain way that's out of their control. Following on from that point as well, there is disputing research or opposing research. So there are many cases of people who have gone on to form healthy adult attachments despite having insecure early ones. One example is the Czech twins. We did mention this within Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory. So Andrei and Vanya, they were locked in a cupboard for the first few years of their life by the stepmother. She was really horrible to them. They didn't have any human interaction apart from with each other. So despite not forming an attachment with that caregiver in their early lives, they missed the critical period, they both did go on to form healthy relationships as adults. So it just shows us, even if someone has a negative start, even if they miss the critical period, it's not always negative, it's not always doomed. They can still go on to have healthy relationships when they grow up. And finally, you could criticise the sample, particularly of Hazan and Shaver's study. Like I did mention at the beginning, it came from a volunteer or self-selecting sample, people responding to the newspaper advert saying, yeah, I agree to take part in this study, I want to. And although it did have a good sample size, had an impressive number of responses, it is possible that particular types of people might have responded to an advert asking for experiences of relationships. You're probably only likely to respond to that yourself if you have an overall positive view of your relationship. So, it could have just been a biased sample for that reason. All right, guys. Now, there is quite a lot for this topic, so I'll tell you how you can summarise it, what you definitely need to know. It does come up on your spec, the internal working model, so you need to be able to outline the role of this, and you do need the definition for it. Look back in your notes for Bowlby's monotropic theory to get the full definition. You do need to know the key study, Hazan and Shaver, and remember this is the influence of attachment on romantic relationships in adulthood. So if a question did ask you about adult relationships, this is an important one to talk about. So I would make sure you knew the detailed methodology of that one, know that one in a lot of detail. For the effects on childhood friendships, it's good to know the general effects. So it's good to be able to say, like, secure children tended to have the most friends and be less isolated. They were less likely to be involved in bullying, and then say the differences with avoidant and resistant as well. So it is good to know the general effects. But I would also say just learn one of those studies, either Kearns or Myron Wilson and Smith. If you know one of those studies, but also the general effects, that will be enough. And then similarly for the effects on parenting, just learn one of those studies, either Quinton or Bailey et al. Remember, you do already have notes for Bailey et al. In Bowlby's monotropic theory, but if you feel like you can understand and talk about the Quinton one better, that is fine, you can use that one. And then with the evaluation points that we just went through on the last couple of slides, just choose 4 of those, okay? We've got to think the worst type of question that we could get on this topic is a 16 mark question. 4 of those evaluation points would be enough, as would the rest of this content, like 1 study for each of those sections be. Because again, you've got to think they can only ask you about the things that are named on your spec. So they could say, outline 1 study into the effects of attachment on adult relationships or childhood relationships. They can ask you that general question, but they won't ask you specifically outline the results of Hazan and Shaver or Myron Wilson and Smith or Quinton. They won't ask you about specific named studies, so you can use whichever you want. So with those 2, just learn one of the studies, whichever you can understand the best. Alright, so possible essay that you could get for this topic. They could specifically ask you about either childhood or adulthood, but I think if they did, that would only be an 8 marker, because there's not really enough that you could say about just one of those. But if it just asks later relationships in general, and then would include childhood and adult, you can use some of the studies for the different ones. So this would be, I think, the 16 marker that could come up if it did. Also, when it says discuss research, this can mean studies or theory. So if it comes up discuss research, you don't have to think it all has to be research studies. Research can just be more general, and it can just mean like a general theoretical idea about a topic. Okay? Now, there are 2 ways you could approach this essay. You are going to plan it for me, so I'll go through the 2 options of approaching it. Option 1, for your AO1, remember this was your knowledge of the topic, so knowledge of this topic. If you're using option 1, your AO1 could be outline the internal working model and its effects on the different types of relationships. Okay, so just general, how does someone's internal working model that they form when they're a child affect, in general, these types of relationships that they have later on? So that would be the AO1, so you'd want to make sure you add enough for about 2 paragraphs for that, if you've got enough to say. You could then use the studies as supporting evidence for each of your AO1 points, okay, and that could be your AO3. So in your AO1, you would have said internal working models seem to affect romantic relationships because da-da-da-da. And then your AO3 later on could be the effect of early attachments on romantic relationships is supported by Hazan and Shaver, who studied da-da-da-da-da and found that da-da-da-da this supports because, and then the same for childhood relationships and parenting. Okay, so that would be one option of doing it, using the general idea of all the research as the AO1, and then using the specific studies as AO3, supporting evidence. The other option would be use the research as your AO1 for this topic. Okay, so say certain studies have investigated this and found just like kind of jot it down, outline it, the details of the studies, that could be AO1. And then the AO3 would be evaluating this research or these studies. So those general points like evaluating the methodology of them, the idea that it's deterministic, things like that. Okay, so you've got 2 options. I reckon option 2 is probably the easiest way to write it, but I reckon option 1 is probably more effective. You probably end up with more you could say that way with using the studies as the supporting evidence, but it is up to you, whichever way you want to do it. Remember how we've been planning these essays as well, so looking over your notes for AO1, can you summarise it into 6 key phrases about that topic? That would mean you've got enough for about 2 paragraphs. And then AO3, choose the 4 points that you would use, and then it's 1 paragraph for each of those points. Remember to effectively introduce it, so a strength or a weakness or supporting evidence for this topic is. Explain the point and then elaborate on it as well. So this is important in showing the influence of early attachment on later relationships because So remember to always refer back to the question in your elaboration or your linking sentence. Alright. Now, I am going to get you to plan this for me. You can write it if you want to, but I'm not going to make you. I'm just asking you to plan it. So you can decide on one of those options on the previous slide. And then, as I've just said, see if you can summarise the AO1 information into 6 key points. If you were using option 2, using the studies as AO1, try to summarise each of those studies into 3 points. Okay, because then it still ends up with your 6 points overall, but you've talked about 2 studies. And I would say it's good to do 2. Don't just do 1 study, because then your essay isn't going to have much scope. It's not going to be very varied, so it's not really enough to just do 1 study. You need at least 2. So have you got enough for 2 paragraphs, and have you actually addressed the question? So look at what the question's asking and think, do my AO1 paragraphs address this? Do they relate to this? And then AO3, like we said, choose the 4 points that you would use depending on which option you've chosen. And for your plan, try to summarise them into 1 or 2 sentences each. So something like that. Okay, so like I was saying before as well, identify the point that you're making, in this case the fact that it's deterministic. Make it relevant to what the question's asking, so briefly explain it, and then elaborate on it, link it to the question, say why it is a strength or a weakness. Okay, and this is only a plan, so I'm just ending it with therefore it's a criticism. If we were writing this as a full essay, we'd obviously say therefore this is a criticism of the influence of early attachment on later relationships, but it's fine to just leave it as that as a plan, because we know what we would put if we were writing it as a full essay. Alright, so that's what I'm going to ask you to do this week for this topic, guys. Obviously let me know if you're not sure of it. There is also an extension as well, if you want a bit more practice. You can have a go at this STEM exam question. There's a bit more guidance on this slide, and then the mark scheme is on the next slide. So you could have a go at writing this yourself using the guidance if you need to, or just completely have a go at it without the guidance if you want to, and then have a go at marking it yourself as well. The mark scheme is on the last slide. Right guys, so hopefully this has been useful again. Let me know if you have any questions as always. Take care, see you soon, bye.